Electronic music is music that employs electronic musical instruments and electronic music technology in its production, an electronic musician being a musician who composes and/or performs such music. In general, a distinction can be made between sound produced using electromechanical means and that produced using electronic technology. Examples of electromechanical sound-producing devices include the Telharmonium, Hammond organ, and the electric guitar. Purely electronic sound production can be achieved using devices such as the Theremin, sound synthesizer, and computer. Electronic music was once associated almost exclusively with Western art music, but from the late 1960s on, the availability of affordable music technology meant that music produced using electronic means became increasingly common in the popular domain. Today, electronic music includes many varieties and ranges from experimental art music to popular forms such as electronic dance music. Origins: late 19th century to early 20th century. The ability to record sounds is often connected to the production of electronic music, but not absolutely necessary for it. The earliest known sound recording device was the phonautograph, patented in 1857 by a Permil de Wadler, copyright on Scott de Martinville. It could record sounds visually, but was not meant to play them back. In 1876, engineer Elisha Gray filed a patent for the electromechanical oscillator. This musical telegraph evolved out of his experiments with telephone technology and is the earliest extant patent for producing electronic sound. This oscillator was expanded on by Alexander Graham Bell for the early telephone. By 1878, Thomas A. Edison further developed the oscillator for the phonograph, which also used cylinders similar to Scott's device. Although cylinders continued in use for some time, Emil Berliner developed the disc phonograph in 1887. Lee de Forest's 1906 invention, the triode Audion tube, later had a profound effect on electronic music. It was the first thermionic valve, or vacuum tube, and led to circuits that could create and amplify audio signals, broadcast radio waves, compute values, and perform many other functions. Before electronic music, there was a growing desire for composers to use emerging technologies for musical purposes. Several instruments were created that employed electromechanical designs, and they paved the way for the later emergence of electronic instruments. An electromechanical instrument called the Telharmonium was developed by Thaddeus Kagel in the years 1898 to 1912. However, simple inconvenience hindered the adoption of the Telharmonium, due to its immense size. One early electronic instrument often mentioned may be the Theremin, invented by Professor La, copyright on Theremin circa 1919 to 1920. Other early electronic instruments include the Audion Piano, invented in 1915 by Lee de Forest, who was inventor of triode Audion as mentioned above, the Croix sonore, invented in 1926 by Nikolai Obukhov, and the Onze Martinet, which was most famously used in the Turangler registered trademark La Symphonie by Olivier Messiaen, as well as other works by him. The Onze Martinet was also used by other, primarily French, composers such as André Jolivet. Sketch of a new aesthetic of music. In 1907, just a year after the invention of the triode Audion, Ferruccio Bisni published Sketch of a New Aesthetic of Music, which discussed the use of electrical and other new sound sources in future music. He wrote of the future of microtonal scales in music, made possible by Kagel's dynamophone, only a long and careful series of experiments, and a continued training of the ear, can render this unfamiliar material approachable and plastic for the coming generation, and for art. Also in the Sketch of a New Aesthetic of Music, Bisni states, "Music as an art, our so-called Occidental music, is hardly 400 years old. Its state is one of development, perhaps the very first stage of a development beyond present conception, and we talk of classics, and hallowed traditions. And we have talked of them for a long time. We have formulated rules, stated principles, laid down laws. We apply laws made for maturity to a child that knows nothing of responsibility. Young as it is, this child, we already recognize that it possesses one radiant attribute which signalizes it beyond all its elder sisters. And the lawgivers will not see this marvelous attribute, lest their laws should be thrown to the winds. This child it floats on air. It touches not the earth with its feet. It knows no law of gravitation. It is well nigh incorporeal. Its material is transparent. It is sonorous air. It is almost nature herself. It is free. But freedom is something that mankind have never wholly comprehended, never realized to the full. They can neither recognize or acknowledge it. They disavow the mission of this child. They hang weights upon it. This buoyant creature must walk decently, like anybody else. It may scarcely be allowed to leap when it were its joy to follow the line of the rainbow, and to break sunbeams with the clouds. Through this writing, as well as personal contact, Bisony had a profound effect on many musicians and composers, perhaps most notably on his pupil, Egid Varese, who said, "Together we used to discuss what direction the music of the future would, or rather, should take and could not take as long as the straitjacket of the tempered system." He deplored that his own keyboard instrument had conditioned our ears to accept only an infinitesimal part of the infinite gradations of sounds in nature. He was very much interested in the electrical instruments we began to hear about, and I remember particularly one he had read of called the dynamophone. All through his writings one finds over and over again predictions about the music of the future which have since come true. In fact, there is hardly a development that he did not foresee, as for instance in this extraordinary prophecy, "I almost think that in the new great music, machines will also be necessary and will be assigned a share in it. Perhaps industry, too, will bring forth her share in the artistic ascent." Futurists. In Italy, the Futurists approached the changing musical aesthetic from a different angle. A major thrust of the Futurist philosophy was to value noise, and to place artistic and expressive value on sounds that had previously not been considered even remotely musical. Balilla Pratella's technical manifesto of futurist music states that their credo is, to present the musical soul of the masses, of the great factories, of the railways, of the transatlantic liners, of the battleships, of the automobiles and airplanes. To add to the great central themes of the musical poem the domain of the machine and the victorious kingdom of electricity. On March 11, 1913, futurist Luigi Russolo published his manifesto The Art of Noises. In 1914, he held the first Art of Noises concert in Milan on April 21. This used his intonarumori, described by Russolo as acoustical noise instruments, whose sounds were hand-activated and projected by horns and megaphones. In June, similar concerts were held in Paris. The 1920s to 1930s. This decade brought a wealth of early electronic instruments and the first compositions for electronic instruments. The first instrument, the etherphone, was created by La Copyright on Theremin between 1919 and 1920 in Leningrad, though it was eventually renamed the Theremin. This led to the first compositions for electronic instruments, as opposed to noisemakers and repurposed machines. In 1929, Joseph Schillinger composed first airphonic suite for theremin and orchestra, Premier read with the Cleveland Orchestra with Leon Theremin as soloist. In addition to the theremin, the Ons Martinet was invented in 1928 by Maurice Martinet, who debuted in Paris. The following year, Anil first composed for mechanical devices, electrical noisemakers, motors and amplifiers in his unfinished opera, Mr. Bloom. Recording of sounds made a leap in 1927, when American inventor J. A. Anil developed a recording device that used magnetically coated ribbon. However, this was a commercial failure. 2 years later, Lawrence Hammond established his company for the manufacture of electronic instruments. He went on to produce the Hammond organ, which was based on the principles of the Telharmonium, along with other developments including early reverberation units. Hammond would also go on to invent another electronic instrument, the Novachord, which Hammond's company manufactured from 1939 to 1942. The method of photo-optic sound recording used in cinematography made it possible to obtain a visible image of a sound wave, as well as to realize the opposite goal, synthesizing a sound from an artificially drawn sound wave. In this same period, experiments began with sound art, early practitioners of which include Tristan Tzara, Kurt Schwitters, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and others. Development, 1940s to 1950s, electroacoustic tape music. Low-fidelity magnetic wire recorders had been in use since around 1900, and in the early 1930s the movie industry began to convert to the new optical sound-on-film recording systems based on the photoelectric cell. It was around this time that the German electronics company AEG developed the first practical audio tape recorder, the Magnetophon K1, which was unveiled at the Berlin Radio Show in August 1935. During World War II, Walter Weber rediscovered and applied the AC biasing technique, which dramatically improved the fidelity of magnetic recording by adding an inaudible high-frequency tone. It extended the 1941 K4 magnetophone frequency curve to 10 kHz and improved the dynamic range up to 60 dB, surpassing all known recording systems at that time. As early as 1942 AEG was making test recordings in stereo. However, these devices and techniques remained a secret outside Germany until the end of WWII, when captured magnetophone recorders and reels of FUB and ferric oxide recording tape were brought back to the United States by Jack Mullin and others. These captured recorders and tapes were the basis for the development of America's first commercially made professional tape recorder, the Model 200, manufactured by the American Ampex Company with support from entertainer Bing Crosby, who became one of the first performers to record radio broadcasts and studio master recordings on tape. Magnetic audio tape opened up a vast new range of sonic possibilities to musicians, composers, producers and engineers. Audio tape was relatively cheap and very reliable, and its fidelity of reproduction was better than any audio medium to date. Most importantly, unlike discs, it offered the same plasticity of use as film. Tape can be slowed down, sped up or even run backwards during recording or playback, with often startling effect. It can be physically edited in much the same way as film, allowing for unwanted sections of a recording to be seamlessly removed or replaced. Likewise, segments of tape from other sources can be edited in tape can also be joined to form endless loops that continually play repeated patterns of pre-recorded material. Audio amplification and mixing equipment further expanded tape's capabilities as a production medium, allowing multiple pre-taped recordings to be mixed together and simultaneously recorded onto another tape with relatively little loss of fidelity. Another unforeseen windfall was that tape recorders can be relatively easily modified to become echo machines that produce complex, controllable, high-quality echo and reverberation effects. The spread of tape recorders eventually led to the development of electroacoustic tape music. The first known example was composed in 1944 by Halim El-Daoub, a student at Cairo, Egypt. He recorded the sounds of an ancient Zar ceremony using a cumbersome wire recorder and at the Middle East radio studios processed the material using reverberation, echo, voltage controls, and re-recording. The resulting work was entitled The Expression of Zar and it was presented in 1944 at an art gallery event in Cairo. While his initial experiments in tape-based composition were not widely known outside of Egypt at the time, El-Daoub is also notable for his later work in electronic music at the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center in the late 1950s. Musique concrète. It wasn't long before composers in Paris also began using the tape recorder to develop a new technique for composition called musique concrète. This technique involved editing together recorded fragments of natural and industrial sounds. The first pieces of musique concrète in Paris were assembled by Pierre Schaeffer, who went on to collaborate with Pierre Henry. On October 5, 1948, Radiodiffusion for une section airs broadcast composer Pierre Schaeffer's Etude au chemin de fer. This was the first movement of Cinq copyright Etudes de Brutes, and marked the beginning of studio realizations and musique concrète. Schaeffer employed a disc-cutting lathe, 4 turntables, a 4-channel mixer, filters, an echo chamber, and a mobile recording unit. Not long after this, Henry began collaborating with Schaeffer, a partnership that would have profound and lasting effects on the direction of electronic music. Another associate of Schaeffer, Egid Varese, began work on Dar copyright certs, a work for chamber orchestra and tape. The tape parts were created at Pierre Schaeffer's studio, and were later revised at Columbia University. In 1950, Schaeffer gave the first public concert of Musique concrète at the École Normale de Musique de Paris. Schaeffer used a PA system, several turntables, and mixers. The performance did not go well, as creating live montages with turntables had never been done before. Later that same year, Pierre Henry collaborated with Schaeffer on Symphonie pour un homme seul, the first major work of Musique concrète. In Paris in 1951, in what was to become an important worldwide trend, RTF established the first studio for the production of electronic music. Also in 1951, Schaeffer and Henry produced an opera, Orpheus, for concrete sounds and voices. Electro-niche music. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen worked briefly in Schaeffer's studio in 1952, and afterward for many years at the WDR Cologne's studio for electronic music. In Cologne, what would become the most famous electronic music studio in the world was officially opened at the radio studios of the NWDR in 1953, though it had been in the planning stages as early as 1950 and early compositions were made and broadcast in 1951. The brainchild of Werner Meyer-Eppeler, Robert Baer, and Herbert Immert, the studio was soon joined by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Gottfried Michael Koenig. In his 1949 thesis Elektronische Klangerzeugung, Elektronische Musik und Synthesizers, Meyer-Eppeler conceived the idea to synthesize music entirely from electronically produced signals. In this way, electroniche music was sharply differentiated from French musique concrète, which used sounds recorded from acoustical sources. With Stockhausen and Mauricio Kagel in residence, it became a year-round hive of charismatic avant-gardism, sick on two occasions combining electronically generated sounds with relatively conventional orchestrizer Euro and Mixter and Hymnen, Drittregion mit Orchester. Stockhausen stated that his listeners had told him his electronic music gave them an experience of outer space, sensations of flying, or being in a fantastic dream world. More recently, Stockhausen turned to producing electronic music in his own studio in Car 1/4 TEN, his last work in the medium being Cosmic Pulses. Japanese electronic music, while early electric instruments such as the Onsma-Tenet, Theremin and Trotonium were little known in Japan prior to World War II, certain composers such as Minoru Shibata had known about them at the time. Several years after the end of World War II, musicians in Japan began experimenting with electronic music, resulting in some of the most dedicated efforts due to institutional sponsorship enabling composers to experiment with the latest audio recording and processing equipment. These efforts represented an infusion of Asian music into the emerging genre and would eventually pave the way for Japan's domination in the development of music technology several decades later. Following the foundation of electronics company Sony in 1946, two Japanese composers, Toru Takemtsu and Minoru Shibata, independently wrote about the possible use of electronic technology to produce music during the late 1940s. In 1948, Takemtsu conceived of a technology that would bring noise into tempered musical tones inside a busy small tube, an idea similar to Pierre Schaeffer's Musique concrète the same year, which Takemtsu was unaware of until several years later. In 1949, Shibata wrote about his concept of a musical instrument with very high performance that can synthesize any kind of sound waves, and is operated very easily, predicting that with such an instrument, the music scene will be changed drastically. The same year, Sony developed the magnetic tape recorder G-Type, which became a popular recording device in courtrooms and government offices, leading to Sony releasing the H-Type for home use by 1951. In 1950, the Jikan Kobo Electronic Music Studio would be founded by a group of musicians in order to produce experimental electronic music using Sony tape recorders. It included musicians such as Toru Takemtsu, Kuniharu Akiyama, and Joji Yuasa, and was supported by Sony, which offered them access to the latest audio technology, hired Takemtsu to compose electronic tape music to demonstrate their tape recorders, and sponsored concerts. The first electronic tape music from the group were Toruo no Onna, and Peace Be, completed in 1951 by Kuniharu Akiyama. Many of the electroacoustic tape pieces they produced were usually used as incidental music for radio, film, and theatre. They also held concerts such as 1953's Experimental Workshop, Fifth Exhibition, which employed an auto-slide, a machine developed by Sony that made it possible to synchronize a slideshow with a soundtrack recorded on tape. They used the same device to produce the concert's tape music at the Sony studio. The concert, along with the experimental electroacoustic tape music they produced, anticipated the introduction of Musique concrète in Japan later that year. Beyond the Jiken Kobo, several other composers such as Yasushi Akutagawa, Saburo Tominaga and Shiro Fukai were also experimenting with producing radiophonic tape music between 1952 and 1953. Japan was introduced to Musique concrète through Toshiro Mayuzumi, who in 1952 attended a Schaeffer concert in Paris. On his return to Japan, he experimented with a short tape music piece for the 1952 comedy film Carmen Giangiusu and then produced X, Y, Z for Musique concrète, broadcast by the JOQR radio station in 1953. Mayuzumi also composed another Musique concrète piece for Yukio Mishima's 1954 radio drama Boxing. Schaeffer's French concept of objet sonore, however, was not influential among Japanese composers, whose main interest in music technology was instead to, according to Mayuzumi, overcome the restrictions of the materials or the boundary of human performance. This led to several Japanese electroacoustic musicians making use of serialism and 12-tone techniques, evident in Yoshiro Irino's 1951 dodecaphonic piece Concerto da Camera, in the organization of electronic sounds in Mayuzumi's X, Y, Z for Musique concrète, and later in Shibaita's electronic music by 1956. Following as a model the NWDR Cologne studio, Japan's NHK company established an electronic music studio in Tokyo in 1955, which became one of the world's leading electronic music facilities. The NHK studio was equipped with technologies such as tone generating and audio processing equipment, recording and radiophonic equipment, ons multinet, monochord and melochord, sine wave oscillators, tape recorders, ring modulators, band-pass filters, and 4 and 8-channel mixers. Musicians associated with the studio included Toshiro Mayuzumi, Minoru Shibata, Joji Yuasa, Toshiyoshi Ienagi, and Toru Takemsu. The studio's first electronic compositions were completed in 1955, including Mayuzumi's 5-minute pieces Study I, music for sine wave by proportion of prime number, music for modulated wave by proportion of prime number, and Invention for square wave and sawtooth wave produced using the studio's various tone-generating capabilities, and Shibata's 20-minute stereo piece Musique concrète for stereophonic broadcast. Ikutaro Kakashi founded a repair shop called Kakashi Watch Shop in the late 1940s repairing watches and radios, and then in 1954 founded Kakashi Musen, which by 1960 grew into the company Ace Tone, and by 1972 became the Roland Corporation. Kakashi began producing electronic musical instruments in 1955, with the aim of creating devices that could produce monophonic melodies. During the late 1950s, he produced theremins, ons multinets, and electronic keyboards, and by 1959, a Hawaiian guitar amplifier and electronic organs. American electronic music. In the United States, electronic music was being created as early as 1939, when John Cage published Imaginary Landscape, No. 1, using 2 variable speed turntables, frequency recordings, muted piano, and cymbal. Cage composed 4 more imaginary landscapes between 1942 and 1952, all of which included electronic components. In 1951, Morton Feldman, who would later collaborate with Cage, produced a piece titled Marginal Intersection, scored for winds, brass, percussion, strings, 2 oscillators, and sound effects of riveting, and the score uses Feldman's graph notation. The Music for Magnetic Tape project was formed by members of the New York School, and lasted 3 years until 1954. Cage wrote of this collaboration, "In this social darkness, therefore, the work of Earl Brown, Morton Feldman, and Christian Wolff continues to present a brilliant light, for the reason that at the several points of notation, performance, and audition, action is provocative." Cage completed Williams' mix in 1953 while working with the Music for Magnetic Tape project. The group had no permanent facility, and had to rely on borrowed time in commercial sound studios, including the studio of Louis and Beebe Barron. Columbia Princeton Center. In the same year Columbia University purchased its first tape recorder, a professional Ampex machine for the purpose of recording concerts. Vladimir Usakovsky, who was on the music faculty of Columbia University, was placed in charge of the device, and almost immediately began experimenting with it. Herbert Ruskell writes, "Soon he was intrigued with the new sonorities he could achieve by recording musical instruments and then superimposing them on one another." Usakovsky said later, "I suddenly realized that the tape recorder could be treated as an instrument of sound transformation." On Thursday, May 8, 1952, Usakovsky presented several demonstrations of tape music effects that he created at his Composers Forum, in the Macmillan Theatre at Columbia University. These included transposition, reverberation, experiment, composition, and underwater valse. In an interview, he stated, "I presented a few examples of my discovery in a public concert in New York together with other compositions I had written for conventional instruments." Otto Luening, who had attended this concert, remarked, "The equipment at his disposal consisted of an Ampex tape recorder and a simple box-like device designed by the brilliant young engineer, Peter Morsey, to create feedback, a form of mechanical reverberation. Other equipment was borrowed or purchased with personal funds." Just 3 months later, in August 1952, Usakovsky traveled to Bennington, Vermont at Luening's invitation to present his experiments. There, the two collaborated on various pieces. Luening described the event, "Equipped with earphones and a flute, I began developing my first tape recorder composition. Both of us were fluent improvisers and the medium fired our imaginations." He played some early pieces informally at a party, where a number of composers almost solemnly congratulated us, saying, "This is it." Word quickly reached New York City. Oliver Daniel telephoned and invited the pair to produce a group of short compositions for the October concert sponsored by the American Composers Alliance and Broadcast Music, Incorporated, under the direction of Leopold Stokowski at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. After some hesitation, we agreed. Henry Cole placed his home and studio in Woodstock, New York, at our disposal. With the borrowed equipment in the back of Usakovsky's car, we left Bennington for Woodstock and stayed 2 weeks. In late September, 1952, the traveling laboratory reached Usakovsky's living room in New York, where we eventually completed the compositions. 2 months later, on October 28, Vladimir Usakovsky and Otto Luening presented the first tape music concert in the United States. The concert included Luening's Fantasy in Spatia an impressionistic virtuoso piece using manipulated recordings of flute and Low Speed, an exotic composition that took the flute far below its natural range. Both pieces were created at the home of Henry Cole in Woodstock, NY. After several concerts caused a sensation in New York City, Usakovsky and Luening were invited on to a live broadcast of NBC's Today Show to do an interview demonstration the first televised electroacoustic performance. Luening described the event, "I improvised some flute sequences for the tape recorder. Usakovsky then and there put them through electronic transformations." 1954 saw the advent of what would now be considered authentic electric plus acoustic compositions, acoustic instrumentation augmented accompanied by recordings of manipulated and/or electronically generated sound. 3 major works were premiered that year: Varieties copyright certs, for chamber ensemble and tape sounds, and 2 works by Luening and Usakovsky, Rhapsodic Variations for the Louisville Symphony and A Poem in Cycles and Bells, both for orchestra and tape. Because he had been working at Schaeffer's studio, the tape part for Varieties' work contains much more concrete sounds than electronic, a group made up of wind instruments, percussion and piano alternates with the mutated sounds of factory noises and ship sirens and motors, coming from two loudspeakers. Der Copyright Search was premiered in Paris in the first stereo broadcast on French radio. At the German premiere in Hamburg, which was conducted by Bruno Maderna, the tape controls were operated by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. The title Der Copyright Search suggested to Varese not only all physical deserts, but also the deserts in the mind of man. Not only those stripped aspects of nature that suggest bareness, aloofness, timelessness, but also that remote inner space no telescope can reach, where man is alone, a world of mystery and essential loneliness. In 1958, Columbia Princeton developed the RCA Mark II sound synthesizer, the first programmable synthesizer. Prominent composers such as Vladimir Usakovsky, Otto Luening, Milton Babbitt, Charles Wuorinen, Hallam Daub, Bar 1/4 Lent Arrell and Mario Davidovsky used the RCA synthesizer extensively in various compositions. One of the most influential composers associated with the early years of the studio was Egypt's Hallam Daub who, after having developed the earliest known electronic tape music in 1944, became more famous for Layla and the Poet, a 1959 series of electronic compositions that stood out for its immersion and seamless fusion of electronic and folk music, in contrast to the more mathematical approach used by serial composers of the time such as Babbitt. Daub's Layla and the Poet, released as part of the album Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center in 1961, would be cited as a strong influence by a number of musicians, ranging from Neil Rolnick, Charles Amerkanian and Alice Shields to rock musicians Frank Zappa and the West Coast pop art experimental band Stochastic Music. An important new development was the advent of computers for the purpose of composing music, as opposed to manipulating or creating sounds. Ioannis Xenakis began what is called Musik Stochastic, or stochastic music, which is a composing method that uses mathematical probability systems. Different probability algorithms were used to create a piece under a set of parameters. Xenakis used computers to compose pieces like Street/4 for string quartet and Street/48 for orchestra, Massima Amassima, Street/10, and Atra copyrights. He developed the computer system UPIC for translating graphical images into musical results and composed Mykonos Alpha with it. Mid to late 1950s, in 1954, Stockhausen composed his electro-niche study Euro, the first electronic piece to be published as a score. In 1955, more experimental and electronic studios began to appear. Notable were the creation of the Studio di Fonologia Musicale di Radio Milano, a studio at the NHK in Tokyo founded by Toshiro Mayuzumi, and the Philips Studio at Eindhoven, the Netherlands, which moved to the University of Utrecht as the Institute of Sonology in 1960. The score for Forbidden Planet, by Louis and B. Barron, was entirely composed using custom-built electronic circuits and tape recorders in 1956. The world's first computer to play music was Xerac, which was designed and built by Trevor Pearcey and Maston Beard. Mathematician Jeff Hill programmed the Xerac to play popular musical melodies from the very early 1950s. In 1951 it publicly played the Colonel Bogey March, of which no known recordings exist. However, Xerac played standard repertoire and was not used to extend musical thinking or composition practice. Xerac was never recorded, but the music played was accurately reconstructed. The oldest known recordings of computer-generated music were played by the Ferranti Mark I computer, a commercial version of the Baby Machine from the University of Manchester in the autumn of 1951. The music program was written by Christopher Strachey. The impact of computers continued in 1956. Loren Hiller and Leonard Isaacson composed Iliac Suite for String Quartet, the first complete work of computer-assisted composition using algorithmic composition. Hiller postulated that a computer could be taught the rules of a particular style and then called on to compose accordingly. Later development included the work of Max Matthews at Bell Laboratories, who developed the influential Music I program. In 1957, Music, one of the first computer programs to play electronic music, was created by Max Matthews at Bell Laboratories. Vocoder technology was also a major development in this early era. In 1956, Stockhausen composed Gesang der Jahr 1 Quartangaline, the first major work of the Cologne studio, based on a text from the Book of Daniel. An important technological development of that year was the invention of the Clavivox synthesizer by Raymond Scott with subassembly by Robert Moog. Also in 1957, Kid Bolton and Tom Disavelt released their debut album, Song of the Second Moon, recorded at the Philips studio. The public remained interested in the new sounds being created around the world, as can be deduced by the inclusion of Varieties Pommier copyright electronic, which was played over 400 loudspeakers at the Philips Pavilion of the 1958 Brussels World Fair. That same year, Mauricio Kagel, an Argentine composer, composed Transistor Cubed N2. The work was realized at the WDR studio in Cologne. Two musicians perform on a piano, one in the traditional manner, the other playing on the strings, frame, and case. Two other performers use tape to unite the presentation of live sounds with the future of pre-recorded materials from later on and its past of recordings made earlier in the performance. Expansion, 1960s. These were fertile years for electronic music, a era not just for academia, but for independent artists as synthesizer technology became more accessible. By this time, a strong community of composers and musicians working with new sounds and instruments was established and growing. 1960 witnessed the composition of Leuening's Gargoyles for violin and tape as well as the premiere of Stockhausen's Cantate for electronic sounds, piano, and percussion. This piece existed in two versions, one for 4-channel tape, and the other for tape with human performers. In Cantate, Stockhausen abandoned traditional musical form based on linear development and dramatic climax. This new approach, which he termed moment form, resembles the cinematic splice techniques in early 20th century film. The first of these synthesizers to appear was the Bacilla. Appearing in 1963, it was the product of an effort spearheaded by Musik Konkrete composer Morton Subotnick. The Theremin had been in use since the 1920s, but it attained a degree of popular recognition through its use in science fiction film soundtrack music in the 1950s. In the UK in this period, the BBC Radiophonic Workshop emerged one of the most productive and widely known electronic music studios in the world, thanks in large measure to their work on the BBC science fiction series Doctor Who. One of the most influential British electronic artists in this period was Workshop staff Adelia Derbyshire, who is now famous for her 1963 electronic realisation of the iconic Doctor Who theme, composed by Ron Grainer. In 1961 Joseph Tell established the Center for Electronic Music in Israel at the Hebrew University, and in 1962 Hugh Lacane arrived in Jerusalem to install his creative tape recorder in the center. In the 1990s Tell conducted, together with Dr. Shlomo Markel, in cooperation with the Technion Euro-Israel Institute of Technology, and Volkswagen Stiftung a research project aimed at the development of a novel musical notation system for electronic music. Milton Babbitt composed his first electronic work using the Synthesizer his composition for Synthesizer, which he created using the RCA synthesizer at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center. For Babbitt, the RCA synthesizer was a dream come true for three reasons. First, the ability to pinpoint and control every musical element precisely. Second, the time needed to realize his elaborate serial structures were brought within practical reach. Third, the question was no longer, what are the limits of the human performer? But rather, what are the limits of human hearing? The collaborations also occurred across oceans and continents. In 1961, Usakovsky invited Varese to the Columbia Princeton studio. Upon arrival, Varese embarked upon a revision of DAR copyright certs. He was assisted by Mario Davidovsky and Bar 1/4 Lentarel. The intense activity occurring at CPEMC and elsewhere inspired the establishment of the San Francisco Tape Music Center in 1963 by Morton Subotnick, with additional members Pauline Oliveros, Ramon Sender, Anthony Martin, and Terry Riley. Riley's overdubbed recording A Rainbow in Curved Air employed various electronic keyboard instruments, all played by the composer-improviser. Later, the center moved to Mills College, directed by Pauline Oliveros, where it is today known as the Center for Contemporary Music. Simultaneously in San Francisco, composer Stan Scharf and equipment designer Doug Meachern presented the first OE Audium concert at San Francisco State College, followed by a work at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, conceived of as in time, controlled movement of sound in space. 12 speakers surrounded the audience, 4 speakers were mounted on a rotating, mobile-like construction above. In an SFMOMA performance the following year, San Francisco Chronicle music critic Alfred Frankenstein commented, "The possibilities of the space-sound continuum have seldom been so extensively explored." In 1967, the first Audium, OE Sound Space Continua opened, holding weekly performances through 1970. In 1975, enabled by seed money from the National Endowment for the Arts, a new Audium opened, designed floor-to-ceiling for spatial sound composition and performance. OE in contrast, there are composers who manipulated sound space by locating multiple speakers at various locations in a performance space and then switching or panning the sound between the sources. In this approach, the composition of spatial manipulation is dependent on the location of the speakers and usually exploits the acoustical properties of the enclosure. Examples include Varieties' Poem Electronic and Stanley Scharf's SICK Audium installation, currently active in San Francisco through weekly programs. Scharf sculpts a Eurosound, performing now digitized spatial works live through 176 speakers. A well-known example of the use of Moog's full-sized Moog modular synthesizer is the Switched On Bach album by Wendy Carlos, which triggered a craze for synthesizer music. Pietro Grossi was an Italian pioneer of computer composition and tape music, who first experimented with electronic techniques in the early 60s. Grossi was a cellist and composer, born in Venice in 1917. He founded the S2FM in 1963 in order to experiment with electronic sound and composition. Computer music. Xerox, the first computer to play music, did so publicly in August 1951. One of the first large-scale public demonstrations of computer music was a pre-recorded national radio broadcast on the NBC radio network program Monitor on February 10, 1962. In 1961, LaFar Stewart programmed Iowa State University's Cyclone computer to play simple, recognizable tunes through an amplified speaker that had been attached to the system originally for administrative and diagnostic purposes. An interview with Mr. Stewart accompanied his computer music. Laurie Spiegel is also notable for her development of Music Mouse, an intelligent instrument for Macintosh, Amiga, and Atari computers. The intelligent instrument name refers to the program's built-in knowledge of chord and scale convention and stylistic constraints. She continued to update the program through Macintosh OS 9, and as of 2012, it remained available for purchase or demo download from her website. The late 1950s, 1960s and 1970s also saw the development of large mainframe computer synthesis. Starting in 1957, Max Matthews of Bell Labs developed the music programs, culminating in Music B, a direct digital synthesis language, Live Electronics. In America, live electronics were pioneered in the early 1960s by members of Milton Cohen's Space Theater in Ann Arbor, Michigan, including Gordon Mummer and Robert Ashley, by individuals such as David Tudor around 1965, and the Sonic Arts Union, founded in 1966 by Gordon Mummer, Robert Ashley, Alvin Lucier, and David Bierman. Once festivals, featuring multimedia theater music, were organized by Robert Ashley and Gordon Mummer in Ann Arbor between 1958 and 1969. In 1960, John Cage composed Cartridge Music, one of the earliest live electronic works. In Europe in 1964, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen composed Microphony for Tam Tam, handheld microphones, filters, and potentiometers, and Mixter for orchestra, 4 sine wave generators, and 4-ring modulators. In 1965 he composed Microphony 2 for choir, Hammond organ, and ring modulators. The jazz composers and musicians Paul Blee and Annette Peacock performed some of the first live concerts in the late 1960s using Moog synthesizers. Peacock made regular use of a customized Moog synthesizer to process her voice on stage and in studio recordings. In 1966–67, Reed Ghazala discovered and began to teach circuit bending the application of the creative short circuit, a process of chance short-circuiting, creating experimental electronic instruments, exploring sonic elements mainly of timbre and with less regard to pitch or rhythm, and influenced by John Caggia's unregistered trademark aleatoric music, SIG concept. Popularization, 1970s to early 1980s, synthesizers. Released in 1970 by Moog Music, the Minimoog was among the first widely available, portable and relatively affordable synthesizers. It became the most widely used synthesizer in both popular and electronic art music. Patrick Gleason, playing live with Herbie Hancock in the beginning of the 1970s, pioneered the use of synthesizers in a touring context, where they were subject to stresses the early machines were not designed for. In 1974, the WDR studio in Cologne acquired an M-Synthi 100 synthesizer, which a number of composers used to produce notable electronic works including Rolf Gielha's Var 1 Quarten and a Forward Deutsche Taktkurrency NZE, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Sirius, and John Maguire's Pulse Music 3. The early 1980s saw the rise of bass synthesizers, the most influential being the Roland TB-303, a bass synthesizer and sequencer released in late 1981 that later became a fixture in electronic dance music, particularly acid house. One of the first to use it was Sharanjit Singh in 1982, though it wouldn't be popularized until Future's Acid Tracks in 1987. ICAM, STEIM, and Electromusic Studion. ISCAM in Paris became a major center for computer music research and realization and development of the SIG 4X computer system, featuring then revolutionary real-time digital signal processing. Pierre Boulez's RA copyright Pons for 24 musicians and 6 soloists used the 4X to transform and route soloists to a loudspeaker system. STEIM is a center for research and development of new musical instruments in the electronic performing arts, located in Amsterdam, Netherlands. STEIM has existed since 1969. It was founded by Misha Menschelberg, Louis Andriessen, Peter Schott, Dick Raelmakers, Jan van Vlijmen, Reinbert de Lee, and Conrad Buymer. This group of Dutch composers had fought for the reformation of Amsterdam's feudal music structures. They insisted on Bruno Moderne's appointment as musical director of the Concertgebouw Orchestra and enforced the first public fundings for experimental and improvised electronic music in the Netherlands. Electromusic Studion, formerly known as Electroacoustic Music in Sweden, is the Swedish National Centre for Electronic Music and Sound Art. The research organization started in 1964 and is based in Stockholm. Rise of popular electronic music. In the late 1960s, pop and rock musicians, including the Beach Boys and the Beatles, began to use electronic instruments, like the Theremin and Mellotron, to supplement and define their sound. By the end of the decade, the Moog synthesizer took a leading place in the sound of emerging progressive rock with bands including Pink Floyd, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Genesis making them part of their sound. Instrumental prog rock was particularly significant in continental Europe, allowing bands like Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Can, and Faust to circumvent the language barrier. Their synthesizer-heavy krautrock, along with the work of Brian Eno, would be a major influence on subsequent synth rock. Electronic rock was also produced by several Japanese musicians, including Eyes Automata's Electric Samurai, Switched On Rock, which featured Moog synthesizer renditions of contemporary pop and rock songs, and Osamu Kitajima's progressive rock album Benzaten. The mid-1970s saw the rise of electronic art music musicians such as Jean-Michel Jarre, Vangelis, and Automata, who with Brian Eno were a significant influence on the development of New Age music. After the arrival of punk rock, a form of basic synth rock emerged, increasingly using new digital technology to replace other instruments. Pioneering bands included Ultravox with their 1977 single Hiroshima Mon Amour, Yellow Magic Orchestra from Japan, Gary Newman, Depeche Mode, The Human League, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark and Tubeway Army from the UK, and Devo from the US. Yellow Magic Orchestra in particular helped pioneer synthpop with their self-titled album and Solid State Survivor. The definition of MIDI and the development of digital audio made the development of purely electronic sounds much easier. These developments led to the growth of synthpop, which after it was adopted by the New Romantic movement, allowed synthesizers to dominate the pop and rock music of the early 80s. Key acts included Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, A Flock of Seagulls, Culture Club, Talk Talk, Japan and the Eurythmics. Synthpop sometimes used synthesizers to replace all other instruments, until the style began to fall from popularity in the mid-1980s. Sequencers and drum machines. Music sequencers began being used around the mid-20th century, and Tomatas albums in mid-1970s being later examples. In 1978, Yellow Magic Orchestra were using computer-based technology in conjunction with a synthesizer to produce popular music, making their early use of the microprocessor-based Roland MC8 microcomposer sequencer. Drum machines, also known as rhythm machines, also began being used around the late 1950s, with a later example being Osamu Kitajima's progressive rock album Benzane, which used a rhythm machine along with electronic drums and a synthesizer. In 1977, Ultravox's Hiroshima Mon Amour was one of the first singles to use the metronome-like percussion of a Roland Trail 77 drum machine. In 1980, Roland Corporation released the TR-808, one of the first and most popular programmable drum machines. The first band to use it was Yellow Magic Orchestra in 1980, and it would later gain widespread popularity with the release of Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing and Afrika Bambaatā's Planet Rock in 1982. The Trail 808 was a fundamental tool in the later Detroit techno scene of the late 1980s, and was the drum machine of choice for Derek May and Juan Atkins. Birth of MIDI. In 1980, a group of musicians and music merchants met to standardize an interface that new instruments could use to communicate control instructions with other instruments and computers. This standard was dubbed Musical Instrument Digital Interface and resulted from a collaboration between leading manufacturers, initially Sequential Circuits, Oberheim, Rolando Euro, and later, other participants that included Yamaha, Korg, and Koei. A paper was authored by Dave Smith of Sequential Circuits and proposed to the Audio Engineering Society in 1981. Then, in August 1983, the MIDI Specification 1.0 was finalized. MIDI technology allows a single keystroke, control wheel motion, pedal movement, or command from a microcomputer to activate every device in the studio remotely and in synchrony, with each device responding according to conditions predetermined by the composer. MIDI instruments and software made powerful control of sophisticated instruments easily affordable by many studios and individuals. Acoustic sounds became reintegrated into studios via sampling and sampled room-based instruments. Miller-Pouquet developed graphic signal processing software for 4X called Max and later ported it to Macintosh for real-time MIDI control, bringing algorithmic composition availability to most composers with modest computer programming background. Digital synthesis. In 1975, the Japanese company Yamaha licensed the algorithms for frequency modulation synthesis from John Chowning, who had experimented with it at Stanford University since 1971. Yamaha's engineers began adapting Chowning's algorithm for use in a digital synthesizer, adding improvements such as the key scaling method to avoid the introduction of distortion that normally occurred in analog systems during frequency modulation. However, the first commercial digital synthesizer to be released would be the Australian Fairlight Company's Fairlight CMI in 1979, as the first practical polyphonic digital synthesizer sampler system. In 1980, Yamaha eventually released the first FM digital synthesizer, the Yamaha GS1, but at an expensive price. In 1983, Yamaha introduced the first standalone digital synthesizer, the DX7, which also used FM synthesis and would become one of the best-selling synthesizers of all time. The DX7 was known for its recognizable bright tonalities that was partly due to an overachieving sampling rate of 57 kHz. Barry Vico describes one of his experiences with early computer sounds. At ISCAM in Paris in 1982, flutist Larry Beauregard had connected his flute to DG Ugno's 4X audio processor, enabling real-time pitch following. On a Guggenheim at the time, I extended this concept to real-time score following with automatic synchronized accompaniment, and over the next 2 years Larry and I gave numerous demonstrations of the computer as a chamber musician, playing Handel flute sonatas, Boulez's sonatine for flute and piano, and by 1984 my own Synapse 2 for flute and computer, the first piece ever composed expressly for such a setup. A major challenge was finding the right software constructs to support highly sensitive and responsive accompaniment. All of this was pre-MIDI, but the results were impressive even though heavy doses of tempo rubato would continually surprise my synthetic performer. In 1985 we solved the tempo rubato problem by incorporating learning from rehearsals. We were also now tracking violin, since our brilliant, young flautist had contracted a fatal cancer. Moreover, this version used a new standard called MIDI, and here I was ably assisted by former student Miller Paquette, whose initial concepts for this task he later expanded into a program called Max. Chiptunes. The new availability of low-cost home computers in the 80s and 90s led to the rise of chiptunes. Chiptunes, sheet music, or chip music is music written in sound formats where many of the sound textures are synthesized or sequenced in real time by a computer or video game console sound chip, sometimes including sample-based synthesis and low-bit sample playback. Many chip music devices featured synthesizers in tandem with low-rate sample playback. The characteristic low-fi sound of chip music was initially the result of early sound cards' technical limitations. However, the sound has since become sought after in its own right. Late 1980s to 1990s, rise of dance music. In the late 1980s, dance music records made using only electronic instruments became increasingly popular. The trend has continued to the present day with modern nightclubs worldwide regularly playing electronic dance music. Nowadays, electronic dance music is so popular that dedicated genre radio stations and TV channels exist. Advancements. Other recent developments included the Todd Matchover composition Begin Again Again for Hypercello, an interactive system of sensors measuring physical movements of the cellist. Max Matthews developed the conductor program for real-time tempo, dynamic and timbre control of a pre-input's electronic score. Morton Subotnick released a multimedia CD-ROM All My Hummingbirds Have Alibis. 2000s and 2010s. In recent years, as computer technology has become more accessible and music software has advanced, interacting with music production technology is now possible using means that bear no relationship to traditional musical performance practices, for instance, laptop performance and live coding. In general, the term live PA refers to any live performance of electronic music, whether with laptops, synthesizers, or other devices. In the last decade, a number of software-based virtual studio environments have emerged, with products such as Propellerhead's Reason and Ableton Live finding popular appeal. Such tools provide viable and cost-effective alternatives to typical hardware-based production studios, and thanks to advances in microprocessor technology, it is now possible to create high-quality music using little more than a single laptop computer. Such advances have democratized music creation, leading to a massive increase in the amount of home-produced electronic music available to the general public via the Internet. Artists can now also individuate their production practice by creating personalized software synthesizers, effects modules, and various composition environments. Devices that once existed exclusively in the hardware domain can easily have virtual counterparts. Some of the more popular software tools for achieving such ends are commercial releases such as Max MSP and Reactor and open-source packages such as Xsound, Pure Data, Super Collider, and Chuck. Circuit bending. Circuit bending is the creative customization of the circuits within electronic devices such as low-voltage, battery-powered guitar effects, children's toys and small digital synthesizers to create new musical or visual instruments and sound generators. Emphasizing spontaneity and randomness, the techniques of circuit bending have been commonly associated with noise music, though many more conventional contemporary musicians and musical groups have been known to experiment with bent instruments. Circuit bending usually involves dismantling the machine and adding components such as switches and potentiometers that alter the circuit. With the revived interest for analog synthesizers, circuit bending became a cheap solution for many experimental musicians to create their own individual analog sound generators. Nowadays many schematics can be found to build noise generators such as the Atari Punk console or the Dub Siren, as well as simple modifications for children toys such as the famous Speak and Spells that are often modified by circuit benders. Reed Ghazala is commonly referred to as the father of circuit bending due to his initial discoveries with the Speak and Spell, and has held apprenticeships and workshops since beginning his work. See also: Audium, Beaver and Krause, Claviolin, Electronic Setbut, List of electronic music genres, New interfaces for musical expression, Ondiolin, Sound installation, Sound sculpture, Spectral music, Tracker music, Timeline of electronic music genres, Footnotes. References. Further reading: Bogdanov, Vladimir, Chris Woodstra, Stephen Thomas Lewin, and John Bush, ed., The All-Music Guide to Electronica, The Definitive Guide to Electronic Music, AMG Allmusic Series, San Francisco, Backbeat Books, ISBN A0-87930-628-9. Best of Electronic Music Podcasts Euroc Live A. Patterson Light and Sound by Mikhail Shikalin, iTunes.apple.com. Best of Electronic Music, Cummins, James, Ambrosia, About a Kaiteria Euro, an investigation of electronica music and party culture, Toronto, Ontario, Clark Nova Books, ISBN A978-0. -9784892-1-Tour, Dostal, Andreas, Gerard Eckel, and Denise Peters. Bodily Expression in Electronic Music, Perspectives on Reclaiming Performativity. Routledge Research in Music 2. London and New York, Routledge. ISBN 978-0-415-89080-9. Heifetz, Robin J., ed., On the Wires of Our Nerves, The Art of Electroacoustic Music, Cranbury, New Jersey, Associated University Presses, ISBN A0-8387-5155-5. Kahn, Douglas, Noise, Water, Meat, A History of Sound in the Arts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT Press, ISBN A0-262-11243-4, New edition 2001, Ketlual, Ben, Electronic Music Pioneers, NP. Course Technology, Incorporated, ISBN A1-931-140-17-0. Licata, Thomas, ed., Electroacoustic Music, Analytical Perspectives, Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press, ISBN A0-313-31420-9. Macon, Edward L., Rocking the Classics, English Progressive Rock and the Counterculture, Oxford and New York, Oxford University Press, ISBN A0-5098887-0A. Manning, Peter, Electronic and Computer Music, Oxford and New York, Oxford University Press, ISBN A0-514,484-8. Prendergast, Mark, The Ambient Century, From Mahler to Trance, The Evolution of Sound in the Electronic Age, Forward, SIG by Brian Eno, New York, Bloomsbury, ISBN A9780747542131, ISBN 1-58234-323-3A. Reynolds, Simon, Energy Flash, A Journey Through Rave Music and Dance Culture, London, Pan Macmillan, ISBN A0-330-35056-0. Schaefer, John, New Sounds, A Listener's Guide to New Music, New York, HarperCollins, ISBN A0-06-097081-2. Shanken, Edward A., Art and Electronic Media, London, Phaidon, ISBN A978-0-7148-4782-5. Shapiro, Peter, ed., Modulations, A History of Electronic Music, Throbbing Words on Sound, New York, Kaipana Productions, ISBN A1-891024-06. Sam, Sicko, Dan, Techno Rebels, The Renegades of Electronic Funk, New York, Billboard Books, ISBN A0-8230-8428-0. Strange, Alan, Electronic Music, Systems, Techniques, and Controls, 2nd ed., W. C. Brown Company. ISBN 0-697-03602-2. Wells, Thomas, The Technique of Electronic Music, New York, Shermer Books. London, Collier Macmillan, ISBN A978-02-872,830-8. External links, A Timeline of Electronic Music, A Chronology of Computer and Electronic Music, 120 Years of Electronic Music. History of Electronic Musical Instruments 1880 to Present Day, Art of the States, Electronic Small Collection of Electronic Works by American Composers, XERAC. The Computation Laboratory at the University of Melbourne's Department of Computer Science and Software Engineering, Electronic Music Foundation, Small EDM Collection, Computer Music Center, Euroc.